My name is Jason.
My name is Tom.
And this is Fear of a Black Dragon, an old school RPG podcast.
And in this episode, no one knows what it's like to be the bad man behind closed doors.
Our first segment is the basic crawl.
Behind Closed Doors, or Damn Drinshire, is a 57-page setting book for Best Left Buried, published by Soul Muppet Publishing in 2020. It was written by Luke Gearing, edited by Fiona Geist and Jarek Crader, and illustrated by Ben Brown. It features cartography by Patrick Eiler and layout by David N. Wilkie. The book is essentially a setting book for a short campaign, which has as its backdrop an inquisition being conducted by a group of witch hunters called the Merciful Fellowship of the Flame Pursuant. The player characters, which are called Crypt Diggers in Best Left Buried, have been hired by this inquisition to conduct investigations in the county in order to find and try witches. The characters are given a few leads to kick off with, but as they interact with the various parts of the setting, they discover the situation is much more grim than what they were led to believe, and even find themselves wrapped up in some local factional warfare. Now, the book does not contain a set of discrete scenes, as you might find in a typical mystery scenario, but rather the GM is given the truth of the matter and encouraged to improvise as needed.
On to the book's contents. The book starts with some information about Brutus Lycan, a political ladder climber who has hired the player characters. From there, we get information about the Merciful Fellowship of the Flame Pursuant and the Holy Writs the characters are empowered by. Next, we have an interesting section that measures public opinion based on whether and how the party brings witches to justice. Next is a section on how to conduct witch trials. Then we begin our exploration of Drinshire, the county all this witch hunting is to take place in. Each of the following communities and locations has a few pages detailing important NPCs, locations, and activities. They are the largely abandoned border town of Leichdorf, Krop, which has its homes on stilts, Vostein, which is in the mountains, Althuf, which is near the forest, Von Dieter, I suppose, Manor, where a murder has happened, Drunten, Ruten, and the Arnok Forest, where a Beastman curse is the principal problem being dealt with, and Nussblinger and their many pigs. The next major section is about Castle Ascania, which the party learns does not exist in any official records. There are all kinds of weird things going on in this castle. The castle has no outer walls or gatehouse, for example. Inside is just a maze of corridors, strange servants, and rooms that are generated upon entry, I gather both in the fiction and by the GM, using a series of tables, with each room getting weirder and weirder the more the party explores. Speaking of those room generation tables, everything is divided into progressively stranger sections. Normal, eerie, strange, weird, and chaotic. The very last entry on these tables is the heart of the house, a literal heart that is a psychic manifestation of hunting and violence. The next major section is Drinharrow, a city that is, quote, as taut as a bloated corpse's skin. We learn about the city's factions, some key locations, rumors, and then some special keyed location areas, Immedinger Hospital and Wetton Manor. Then we have some clue lists that contains leads the player characters can follow up on in the city. Then we have a timeline of events, ticking off what happens in the lead up to the player characters arriving on the scene, meeting the whole county, and what will happen should they not get involved with the things going on there. Finally, we have a map of the county. So, bona fides. Tom?
Few to none, I'm afraid. I've only read this one. How about you?
I ran it for three-hour sessions using Trophy Gold. I will note here that the book actually has much more than 3 sessions worth of stuff in it. I used all the material in the book to build out a scenario for the sessions that I had. Things we liked about Behind Closed Doors. Why don't we start with some visual and presentational stuff, Tom?
Sure. Well, it's another one of those OSR modules that goes for the more or less in-period look. So it resembles in font choice and illustration and layout, I want to say like a 17th century broadsheet kind of thing.
Yes.
With the blocky font choice is excellent in that respect. And there's a mix of custom done art, and then there's a public domain art that I think are woodcuts from not exactly medieval, and I imagine not chosen strictly from any particular time period, but all give that dark Middle European feel to the whole thing, which is very nicely done.
The layout and design choices are super cool, especially given that it's a scenario about witch hunters. You can imagine in Drinshire, they would have posters hanging up looking for witch hunters or trying to find a particular person accused of witchcraft. And the layout looks like that, right? It looks like one of these like sort of polemics or broadsides, which I think is super, super interesting. It leads a little bit into something I wanted to say about the book, which is there's a really interesting efficiency with which the information is presented throughout this book that I wanted to comment on a little bit. This is worth noting because the book has in the very beginning as a stated goal that you are meant to improvise a lot of this gameplay on the fly. And so I think the way that the visual design and the layout assists or does not assist that is really important to look at. Frequently when you get to a new town or a new location, you are given some really basic details. So for example, Drinshire, the county itself, we're given a very, very brief little description of what Drinshire is all about, and then 3 bullet points of things to know. And so I will just read those 3 bullet points because I think they tell you a lot. The first is that most villages are 10 to 20 huts, the residents engaged in subsistence farming, hunting, or fishing. Second bullet point, all goods flow towards Drinharrow, where they are processed and sold on. Third point, wealth is measured in food, coinage is rare. This is less than like 50 words, but it tells you so much about the location. And every place in the book is like that. The book also does this really interesting thing, getting back to the layout and fonts, where you have discrete bits of information that are essentially cabined off or bracketed by the font choices, by weird boxes or borders. It makes the page seem a little busy at first, but when you're using it, it has the effect of sort of training your mind to cabin off this information and set it apart in a really efficient way. And I actually really, really liked it in play because like in the middle of a paragraph, you might have like 2 font changes to express like a slightly different idea about the thing being discussed in the text. And for whatever reason, for my mind at least, it really pinged my brain to think about and organize the information in a really specific way. And I actually quite liked it. It's kind of something you have to sort of experience, I think. but it worked for me.
Yeah, I noticed that on the read-through as well. It looks very packed and busy at first glance, but when you start to read it, you begin to intuit the differences. And actually, that's the key concept of book design that I think in role-playing games is perhaps less well understood or less acknowledged. So you often see at the beginning of a trad role-playing game, they'll carefully explain to you things that appear in red mean this kind of category of something. And
right.
Here's an example. Whereas actually the way you build this kind of thing, much like in Behind Closed Doors, you can just make up your own system and use it, and the reader will gradually become acclimatized to it.
Right.
Or to give a film example, right? When you watch Memento, I was listening to a podcast about Memento recently. This is why I'm thinking about it. You very quickly figure out if it's in color, it's happening now. If it's in black and white, it's a flashback that is in the opposite direction to the rest of the film. Nobody tells you that. No, there's no like note at the beginning of the movie saying if it's in black and white, it's a flashback. Just the second time it happens, you've got it. And you do that with fonts. You could do that with layout tricks as well that sometimes people don't even notice in book layout. This is a really good example of it because it has that really packed look like old-fashioned printing, you know, when they could only do 1 sheet at a time for the whole newspaper.
Right, yeah.
But it's not overwhelming, which you can compare to some much cleaner looking at first glance layouts that you get. But actually, when you try to navigate it, it's a nightmare. Like there's no real hierarchy.
Because it's a block of text, right?
Yeah. So it's you're right. It's really good. Also, there is that, as you mentioned, the summary. You get 3 points telling you about the whole of Drinshire up top, but that becomes fractal as you go to a smaller location. You get the initial pointers again for a village. You go into a house and into a room. They all have the things as well. And it's great. And you see it even in Castle Ascania, which has that great normal, eerie, weird, chaotic descent. Actually, I've missed a step, haven't I? There's a strange level somewhere in there as well.
A couple of other synonyms for strange.
Exactly. That's sort of like leading you through as you drop down into more detailed levels. And then when you finish that part of the adventure, well, I'm presuming you can confirm if this is true or not. You pop right back up to the district level, and you're back at the more open, freer roaming level of play again.
In practice, it was really interesting. I think that many texts would have you sort of improvise at the table, but you're right. Visually, they don't necessarily support you in that. And this one really does in a way that not only does that, but it also satisfies like an artistic goal, which is really intriguing. NPCs are great. The way they're presented, a name, an age, a few descriptive details, and an italicized section, again, going back to the font, an italicized section with their particular role in the story. This was plenty to work with for each character without a lot of overwhelming and unnecessary detail. I've talked about this a million times, but in particular, I like the way that this book visually presents the information. It's really intriguing.
I found on my read-through, when I wanted to go and check something plot-related, I was ignoring the names and ages and everything. I was just scanning for italicized text, and because that's where the story part is, and then the presentation is in the others. So, yeah, really good. And there's so much in this as well. My next thing I like, actually, if I can go to that, is this kind of has almost every scenario format inside it, doesn't it?
It does.
There's a creepy village, there's a hermit village that's shut off from the rest of the world, you've got a murder mystery, there's a dungeon,
you got a horror castle, you got all that.
You've got factional city politics stuff. It's pretty impressive. And I think it has those, is it 2 or 3 hints that you're given at the beginning from Brutus Lycan?
It's like 2. Yeah.
2. And they are, you could have an adventure that just had those 2 things in. But I think they are designed to basically take you across the map so that you bump into everything else, which I think is great. Yeah.
That's what I gathered too. That's not how I ran it, which we'll put a pin in that for now. Sure. But from a read, that makes a lot of sense to me. I can definitely see that for sure. Yeah, you definitely get your money's worth in this book.
Yeah, definitely.
There's a lot going on. Piggybacking off that idea a little bit, something I really loved about this is based off how I run my sessions and how I frequently have to adapt things to the games I'm playing, because I have never run Best Left Buried, and I haven't looked at Best Left Buried. I don't even know how the game is supposed to go. But for me, this presentation and the way it's and all this like stuff, you could just strip it for parts, right?
Yeah.
You could just like take the pieces you want and build the thing you want. What I ended up doing, my 3 sessions were essentially going through 2 villages, the murder manor, and then a little thing that I constructed for Drin Harrow. We actually did not do Castle Ascania, which I'm really sad about, but I just think I needed more time to do Castle Ascania. But it worked great. We still kind of had the feeling we were still doing the basic activity that the module wants you to be doing. But yeah, you can definitely just like go in here and just take the stuff that fits for what you're doing. And I really love that part of it. If you don't want to just like go step by step, place by place. Speaking of that horror castle, from a read at least, it's very, very cool. I think at some point I have the intention of going back and just doing a Castle Ascania run, because I think it would be very fun to sort of generate those rooms on the fly, and as a sort of GMing challenge, just seeing if I could manage that and roleplay that. I think that would be a really good time. There's just so many good, weird possibilities going on in this castle, and I think it's the kind of thing that players will respond to in a really positive way. Yeah, so is there anything else that you want to say about things you liked?
I love the cartography. I think it's very good. I think it also hints at, if you give the county map to the players, I think it hints at the type of scenario in each place, which is good, because if you're doing a free roaming mini campaign, then they get to pick which one seems most interesting. I am less of a fan, I think, of the drawn pencil artwork in here. I think if you were to take it standalone, I'd say I even don't like it, but in context, it sort of works. It's a little bit horrible and unsettling, so maybe I do like it more than I thought, but I think the cartography is strong, the artwork is fine. Yeah,
I have a slightly different view on the artwork. I think the artwork is good. I think the issue actually is context, which is sometimes the artwork feels a little runty on the page. Like it doesn't really seem like it has pride of place in the layout sometimes.
Maybe that's it, yeah.
It's like we're kind of squishy at the bottom or like in the corner, and I think that maybe, especially given that this layout is so stylized, I think that maybe the artwork is getting swallowed up a little bit, because the pieces that are just like whole pages, there's one of the castle, there's another one of a little like street in the village or something. Those are pretty good.
Actually, that's true. Yes, those are great. Yeah. So,
I think it has to do with like place and position. I don't think it's quite how I would have done it, but I don't think it's bad. The layout is so stylized and strong that it's kind of swallowing up the art a little bit. So yeah, I think that's kind of part of the issue. I have one more thing I want to say about things I liked. The timeline of events, which is something that especially newer modules have. That's something I've noticed more in the newer modules. This here's the stuff that happened before the party arrived. Here's point zero when the party arrived. And here's all the things that would happen if they did not get involved. Going back to this idea of the information being presented in a really efficient manner, I love when modules have this because you're getting like a full history and a full like future history of this place in like 2 pages. And it works so great. I think like in an older module, this would be like 100 pages worth of material, right?
Yes,
that you would have to like sort through. The module says that it doesn't have discrete events or whatever, and I guess it doesn't, but it does have this timeline, which I think is a nice roadmap for how things should go. And it's very, very helpful. Okay. Questions we had about behind closed doors. I have a couple. Tom, looks like you have a few as well. What do you think?
Let's start with something system-based kind of. There's the public opinion mini-system. I guarantee that if I were to GM this, I would forget that most of the time. What are your thoughts?
I think it's a sort of thing that probably comes alive more in a longer-term campaign set in this county. I did not use it myself. I agree with you. I would probably forget.
Yeah, but you're right. Maybe sort of 4 sessions in, you sort of remember it exists and then kind of go through the checklist and do some stuff.
Well, especially if we go back to the whole like busy player characters problem. If you're running a campaign where the player characters are just hitting it and like doing all the investigations really efficiently, this is not even going to become a thing. Public opinion is not going to have time to like settle in or whatever. So that could be a problem as well. If we're dealing with a long timeline, a longer campaign, I think it could maybe be a thing, but I didn't use it.
Yeah. My next question is the usual complaint disguised as question, but I'm going to go for it anyway because I feel like we're going to be saying plenty of nice things about this. There's a lot of typos in here.
There really are. Yeah.
Like really noticeable. And usually, I mean, look, hey, I'm very sympathetic about this. We've all done it. We've all had like a team of a zillion people look at a text 3 times and still miss stuff. But here there are at least 2 or 3 places where there's a gap, like missing words, and there are a couple of different things that could reasonably fill that gap. And while it is easy to make up my answer, I would have liked to know for sure what it was supposed to be. So that's my questionable bit about that. I don't think it really affects the utility of the scenario too much, but it was,
I sympathize, right?
Yeah.
As a publisher, I sympathize. I just put out a book that we went over 10 times and typos still slipped in, right?
The first thing that happens when you get a box of copies is you'll open it and your eyes will fall.
You immediately find the typo. You're like, fuck, right? Yeah, it happens. Yeah. So I totally sympathize. I get it. It does not affect the usability or the readability of the book. I did notice it, though. I also noticed a misuse of IT''s quite a lot.
Yes.
But these are just like very, very small things, but worth pointing out. What's your last question?
My last one is, most of this feels very low prep for the GM. Like, you flip to the page, you just start talking, reading bullet points, except for Drin Harrow City, where we have the rival factions at work. Is that an accurate impression?
That is 100% accurate. The villages and the manor that I ran, which were like the first 2 sessions of my run of it, I ran almost entirely on the fly. I slapped some trophy gold set goals on it, but otherwise I just ran them pretty much from the book. Drin Harrow was harder. Drin Harrow is a lot more complex, has a lot more NPCs and factions and things, and so I did have to sort of construct something a little bit more with that one.
Okay, what about yours?
Did this feel Warhammerish to you? I got like Enemy Within vibes. Did you get those vibes?
What's the old joke? Sort of short answer no with a but, long answer yes with an if. No, it does actually. I think it's not taken as itself. It's not that Warhammery, but you could easily just take this and drop it into a Warhammer game. Yeah, honestly, if you need to expand your Warfront campaign with a bit of witch hunting, easily done. And it, in fact, actually, let's go through it. It's got beastmen in the forest and slight mutation stuff, check. Mud, corruption, chaos worship, sort of. Yeah, I mean, it really... Not
German-sounding villages and stuff.
The reason I'm reluctant to say that it is Warhammery is because that would make it sound like... it's like almost a knockoff Warhammer Fantasy, but I don't think it is. I don't think
that's not what's going on. No,
exactly. It's not. You don't look at it and think, "Oh, this is Warhammer," but they've just taken off the logo. It's very much its own kind of miserablest OSR. But yeah,
we should all strive for so much.
Indeed. But you're right. Easily Warhammerable, almost without any changes at all. Actually, I would say, just need your stats for rolling dice, and I think you'd be good to go.
I love it. What did you think of the Drin Harrow rumor table on page 47?
To be honest, I'm not a huge fan or user of rumor tables anyway, but they're okay, I think.
They're okay. Yeah, that was my opinion too. I was like, these are okay. I thought they were interesting bits of like quote, like I could see an NPC saying that, and I did indeed use them in that way sometimes. But I don't know how like actionable much of it felt, as far as like stuff to use the rumor.
Yes, that's fair. I think. Yeah, they seem a little bit arch. And kind of
arch is a good way of putting it. Yes, very good way of putting it.
I mean, actually, if I look at that page now, I think actually they're pretty solid, and I have enough faith in the team that's produced this that I reckon they've tried these rumours out, and I think if you were to use them, they would send off the players. I believe that players would follow these to interesting locations. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Fair enough. Let's go to the Chain Lightning round. I'll start today. There's a D12 weather table with 9 entries on it. They are very foggy, somewhat foggy, light fog, overcast, light rain, moderate rain, heavy rain, storm, and finally, weak sunlight.
2 NPCs are described as having the following knowledge. They don't know what to think about the murder, but happily tell you what everyone else does.
There is a table entry for the master bedroom in the castle, which reads, skin quilts, bone furniture, unknowable sensual furs.
Pulling back the curtain to view, name of painting here, reveals an out-of-focus, indistinct humanoid figure reaching towards the viewer. The longer the viewing, the less humanoid the figure seems.
Of a group of hunting dogs, pouring through corridors like oil down a slide, claws clattering and eager mouths smiling, all tooth and gum, red maw, silent prowl with terrible baying on the chase.
Riverboaters regularly fight over jetty rights, using the regional fighting style, boat boxing, known for low stances and the use of long, cumbersome staves adapted from riverboaters' oars and punts.
Let's go to the expert delve. Hi listeners, I wanted to let you know that new issues of Codex are now available in the Gauntlet Patreon feed. Codex is the Gauntlet's bi-monthly role-playing game magazine. Each issue is organized around a theme and stuffed with brand new material for your table, including original games and supplemental material for games like Trophy and Brindlewood Bay. Check out Codex by going to patreon.com/gauntlet. Your pledge not only gets you Codex and other Gauntlet publications, but it also supports all the important work we do in the Gauntlet, including this very podcast. If you'd like to try before you buy, there's always a free issue of Codex available on our website, gauntlet-rpg.com. And if you're looking for back issues, you can find them on DriveThruRPG, including in reduced price bundles. Thanks. It's the Expert Delve, our topic today, creating a sense of paranoia at the role-playing game table. Something I experienced quite a bit while we were running behind closed doors, which is what inspired the topic for me. We should note here that when we say paranoia, we mean I mean at least the sort of informal meaning of the word, meaning a sense of intense distrust of people or the environment. We are not talking about the medical definition of paranoia. I think that's worth pointing out to listeners. So, I have a lot of notes here.
Yeah, you do.
I do, yeah. Well, here's the thing. It's been on my mind lately. I have lately been running a lot of, not intentionally, but a lot of sessions that are notionally horror sessions, but have had a very, very strong overlaid paranoia. Like it's paranoid horror. I've been thinking a lot about it, and the feedback I've been getting is that this is how the players feel. I think this is probably something I just do all the time when I'm running certain types of scenarios, but I've been trying to figure out, like, are there actionable or usable practical things that GMs or scenario writers can do to sort of create a sense of paranoia at the role-playing game table? And I think it's worth kicking off with a little discussion about the medium of tabletop role-playing games, because I think that paranoia, it is a pretty close cousin to horror, right? If you have one, you frequently have the other. But in a role-playing game context, there's also you just have certain disadvantages to creating that feeling. We've talked about this in the horror context. We don't have the same kinds of production values as you might have like in a film or a TV show. We are not able to necessarily or as easily manipulate the point of view as you might be able to in a novel, right? Which could really help with a sense of paranoia. And yet films and novels, like role-playing games, do require a certain amount of suspension of disbelief in order to achieve the reader or the viewer feeling a sense of paranoia or like trying to sympathize with the characters feeling a sense of paranoia. And so I think we can accomplish that in a role-playing game. And I think that's where I want to go with this. Like, what do we do to help accomplish this feeling? And so that's where I want to kick off. And in particular, I'm interested in talking about the medium of role-playing games, because I think that, you know, we've talked about in the past of like how you can change what seem like disadvantages in the medium to be advantages at the table when it comes to achieving a certain effect. And when it comes to paranoia in particular, you have a very powerful tool in the separation between in-character knowledge and out-of-character knowledge. And I think this is my main piece of advice today. Something that the players know out of character can absolutely affect the way they feel about the situation in character.
Yes. Yeah, like when we talked about Convergence a while back, that whole thing of how when you encounter a trope, a thing that you know in a movie would be a scary, dangerous thing, even if it's technically or theoretically innocuous to the player character, you're right, that absolutely shades maybe not your in-character behavior, but your experience of what your character is then doing, for sure. What's the disadvantage here, and how does that become an advantage? I guess that's my question.
The disadvantage is one of medium. To some degree, it's really hard to get players to feel creeped out or to feel like they're being watched or to feel mistrustful of the situation. Because at the end of the day, all that's really at stake is just some words on a piece of paper and whatever we say around the table. There's really nothing like at stake that might provoke such a feeling. And so in that sense, the medium can be a bit of a disadvantage. There's table talk, and so it can kind of pull you out as well.
Yeah.
Whereas if you're reading a book that's meant to evoke a certain feeling, you can kind of get wrapped up in it. Or in a film, you have all these like auditory and visual cues. It's a problem of medium, and yet something you can do, what I'm specifically talking about out of character knowledge and in character knowledge. One time I ran this Trophy Gold impromptu horror thing, basically, at this house. The characters were just staying the night at this house, and they had no reason going into it that there was anything strange going on. They didn't even know they were about to do a horror thing until I gave the set goal, which is purely out of character information. Yeah. The set goal was uncover the dark secret of this house. Suddenly it changed the whole vibe of what was happening. Suddenly every player character, from the father to the mother to the child, was viewed with suspicion. Everything they did, every move they made was like, oh, something's happening. Even if nothing was happening, the players felt like something was happening. That's what I mean. That's a way of taking this sort of out-of-character information and out-of-character knowing, which can be a disadvantage in creating a certain type of feeling, and spinning it back around to make it a thing that works.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because I get what you mean now about the lack of control. Because, for example, every character who appears in a role-playing game is in the individual imagination of each person. So whereas in, say, Zodiac, you can portray that guy that works in the convenience store in the movie as looking kind of suspiciously blank-faced or whatever in reaction.
Precisely.
That you can't force that into someone's head without maybe saying,
right,
by the way, this looks a little suspicious, which is, of course, too on the nose for what we're after.
Right.
Whereas one player might view the local convenience store guy as entirely friendly and fine, and the other one is suspicious of him, perhaps for some reason you know nothing of. And yeah, you're right, you want to channel that, don't you?
And then they begin convincing each other there's something wrong.
Yes.
Like, that's always fun. The players, out of character, begin convincing each other that there's something happening here and we need to be worried about it.
Yeah.
And your job as the GM is to just let that ride, right? And let them keep feeling that way.
Yeah.
Sometimes the players, out of character, simply knowing that they're doing a horror scenario or a scenario where they are being watched or whatever, just them knowing that sometimes does a lot of work.
Yeah.
And you can definitely kind of tweak and enhance this a little bit by just posing out of character questions about the environment or the way you describe things as a GM. You can make things that we're noticing as players be things that the players then transfer to their characters, right? In terms of like how they're feeling and how they play it. We've talked about these ideas before, but it's particularly helpful in the paranoid frame. So yeah, working within the medium of RPGs and changing it into an advantage, I think that this using out-of-character knowledge to inform in-character play is a great way of doing that. In terms of setting and environment, I think the setting or the environment of your game can have a big impact on whether a sense of paranoia sets in. A careful GM or scenario writer will think about that. I think it's really important that the characters cannot completely trust the setting or the environment. There has to be at least one element in play that makes things feel unreliable. Does that make sense?
Yeah. But especially that only that it's unreliable, but also that it seems reasonable, or it could be innocuous.
Precisely, yes.
So that you can start to identify the telltale clue that someone is against you. But if you were actually to grab them and start shouting, "Tell me the truth, who are you working for?" everyone else in the diner will go, you realise this is crazy, right? What's your problem? So, yeah, that unsure footing, these key elements that you're choosing to be the platform for the paranoia, there has to be an arguable case in both the innocent and malevolent direction, I guess, yeah.
What really helps is you have some kind of tell or motif that you signal to the players. This is particularly helpful for a wide open or an urban environment. In a wide open or urban environment, if that's where your game is set, I think it would be pretty easy to let the characters slip through the cracks or get lost in the shuffle or surround themselves but with lots of people, safety in numbers kind of situation. But you can maintain that sense of foreboding, that sense of being watched, that sense of mistrust with a tell or a motif. And here I'm thinking of the green eyes in Castronegro.
Classic.
We've talked about this in the specific horror context, but it's also really, really good in the paranoid horror context. Because like you said, it's perfectly reasonable for people to have green eyes. There's nothing weird about that.
Yeah.
Unless you see it all the time. Right? And unless if the characters start to make like strange connections in their minds about what it could mean. That's when the power of a tell or a motif really, really comes into play and can help the big urban environment that would otherwise be easy to sort of get lost in. I think you can always kind of bring it back. Like right when the characters are starting to feel a certain level of comfort, you can have another character across the way doing that thing or showing that thing or appearing that way that pings their brain to be back on edge. I personally like to do paranoid horror in very small, isolated environments. A remote abandoned village, a cabin in the middle of a snowstorm. In an environment like that, and especially in a fantasy game context where NPCs might be magical, the appearance of literally any other character creates a sense of paranoia.
Yes.
Like if they arrive at an abandoned, isolated place and then just someone shows up, paranoia sets in immediately at the table and everyone is on edge. It doesn't matter who the character is, doesn't matter what they're doing, doesn't matter how nice they are. None of it matters. They are instantly mistrustful and they watch that character like a hawk because they know this is a remote, abandoned place. There should not be anyone here, right? And so just the existence of a character. The reason why I say in the fantasy context it can be quite powerful is because there might be really good reasons why a normal human being would not be able to be in this place. But a demon or a ghost or a fantasy creature would be able to be there. They appear normal, but they have abilities that allow them to be in a certain place. And so that's a thing. I recently ran a series called The Croatoa, and in the beginning, the characters are trapped in this cabin and they're locked in by a snowstorm. And just this one character shows up at the door in the middle of the snowstorm. And it created a literal whole session's worth of hand-wringing and paranoia from the players. And the character was not even like any particular danger, at least in the beginning. The machinations of Trophy made them a danger eventually. But in the beginning, it was just like the person who showed up. It was unusual. And they spent the whole session agonizing over it, and it was amazing. They mistrusted everything. Everything became a problem. Every little weird noise, every little appearance of something in the environment, everything was like suspicious at that point. And I thought that was really great. That's how I personally like to do it. I know you have some notes about characters specifically.
Yes, I do. And I suppose this applies mostly for the wide open settings, so where you can have maybe an urban environment where you might have a lot of NPCs that you're meeting or potentially. And my top tip here is to reincorporate NPCs from earlier, but along a kind of spectrum of betrayal, if you will. So you have people who come back, you saw in session 1, here's the guy that you met at the secondhand car place, and here he is again. But he's just going about his business. There is nothing suspicious about this guy. Then you'll have the outright treachery brigade, people who you thought were your friend, but have actually been working for the bad guys all along, and then you're outraged that they've turned on you, and they'll give you something like, well, it's not personal. But in between that, I think, is some really fruitful ground. And for our francophone listeners, I've recently finished reading a campaign by Eno, YNO, called Americana, Le Syndrome du Babylon, which does this really well, where you have these sort of turnarounds where it's a betrayal or a sudden revelation, but when you experience it, you can still be sort of shocked or blindsided by it. But your reaction wouldn't be, this is my enemy. It would be, oh yeah, I'd probably do the same thing in their position. So, for example, someone whose relative has been kidnapped and they have been forced to go do the bad guy's dirty work against you in order to save them. Or in Americana, I think I can do this without spoilers, you meet a couple early on who are very informative about the goings-on across the road. And then about 5 chapters later, you meet them again, and it turns out the reason they'd been keeping such a close watch on what was going on is because they were specifically placed there to do surveillance on that same person by the group that you are now probably an enemy of. So they weren't harming you, but you've now discovered that they're part of a rival faction. And this kind of thing, I don't think you need to decide it really early on either. It's just when the slot arrives in your game for this is the person sent to hunt you down, this is the person standing in your way when you arrive at the old abandoned mine, make it someone from earlier who has a believable reason to be there. And if you've been doing it to a lesser or greater extent throughout, then that retroactively casts everyone they've met so far as potentially having passed on information about them, potentially having done something to them they don't know about. That, I think, will make them nicely paranoid.
I love it. That's fantastic. Okay. I made a list of things I have done in my games that have created a strong sense of paranoia and mistrust at the table. Okay. Feel free to steal these ideas, listeners, and adapt them to your story as needed. Okay, first one. The characters walk into a seemingly abandoned village. On the side of a barn is painted the following warning: do not trust her lies. The characters are trapped in a cabin in a snowstorm. A young man, underdressed for the weather and wearing no shoes, shows up at their door asking for shelter. At night, certain houses put a candle in their window when others are perfectly dark. The locals keep mentioning a forthcoming festival or celebration, but no one will discuss the details of what actually happens at this gathering. That's a good one. Yeah. I've used that a bunch. Some people in the village have a strange symbol carved above their doors, while others do not. Again, it's kind of the candle thing again. The party is invited to a gathering, and when they show up, no one is there. The party is invited to a gathering only to discover they are the, quote, guests of honor, though no one will explain to them why they are the guests of honor. 2 NPCs watch the characters for a bit and then turn to each other and smile.
That's an enemy within style classic, isn't it?
The characters arrive at a hunting lodge where it is not clear what types of animals are regularly hunted there. A bit of unusual matter, like a finger bone, is found in the food being served to the characters. Those are just some things I've done. They work great. Feel free to steal. Tom, you had some caveats about the paranoid.
I think one of the big dangers of the paranoid style is it can cause, let's call it paranoia paralysis, where you have so many options and so many options for who might be working against you. I mean, that's a classic problem with game design in general, too many options. So I think there are a few things to mention here. So for players, there is, I forget which gumshoe book or game it's in, but there's a bit of advice I always remember, which is speaking to the players. Lots of different things could be happening. Only one thing actually is happening. So you should go out and find out what it is. And I think you've just got to be willing to play to lose, or in this case, play to be betrayed.
Right.
Don't do what's the bane of a Vampire the Masquerade LARP and just turtle up and never do anything that's at all risky, because then you'll just be the interesting Fox Mulder paranoid guy. Don't be the boring paranoid guy that Fox Mulder goes to for information who lives in a caravan and never leaves. You want to be the one that's going around. Yeah. And then for GMs, it's the old classic, be a fan of the player characters and mention that you are a fan to the players. So in other words, I'm going to do stuff to you, but only because I believe in you and your characters and I think they'll look cooler and come out and it'll be a fun time. That's really the only way around that possible paralysis. You've just got to have a slightly authorial attitude to your characters. Otherwise, well, it's the old problem. It's like, why would I even go into a dungeon? Yeah. Because we're playing a game about going into a dungeon. So that's
yeah. I also think this is not necessarily appropriate for the fantasy dungeon adventuring context, which we usually work in, but I am very much a part of that school of game design that believes that we should find ways to let players decide when their characters die, as opposed to the rules deciding when the characters die. Because I think that when you have a situation like that, and you're playing in a system like that, the players are willing to take chances more, and you can avoid a turtling up kind of situation. So don't know how applicable it is necessarily here. And you always want to make sure there's still some other stakes at play, even if it's not death. Yeah. But worth pointing out.
But I do have a pseudo-mechanical tip, though, for creating paranoia within the group. Now, of course, this is a thing we haven't really talked about here is intra-party paranoia, which is often similarly the death of a game. So you want to be careful. But I do have a nice trick that I've used a couple times, including when I ran against the cult of the reptile god. So it's very good for one-shots, which is this. So you have your character creation, or you hand out the pre-mades, and let everyone pick their little gear packets. I would put those on cards, so like you have the scholar's gear or the fighter's gear. And then I also wrote up goals for each character, and I have, I think, let's say, the number of player characters plus 3. And you give all of them to the first person to your left, say. And they are things like, go and bring this ancient sutra to the abbot of the monastery. And the second one is, bring this cursed scroll to the secret leader of the evil cult. Or meet up with the bandits who are planning to raid the village. Obviously, many of these would have to be secret. And what you do is the first person takes one of their choice and passes the rest along. And they repeat that all the way around so that you have increasing certainty as to what the options are that remain. The last player has the fewest to choose from, but of course there are extras left over. So even the person who handed them the remaining in-scenario goals doesn't know. And you should do enough so that it's possible that everyone took the night goals, that there are no evil cult members. But you won't know that. And depending on the scenario, when I did the reptile god thing, I sort of identified which ones were in which group and would have different... Like if they had to meet someone in the village, I had to sort of keep track of a little bit of paperwork for myself. But that was very good for the paranoia, because that's out of character, as you mentioned. It's sort of out of character knowledge, influencing in character. And it doesn't cause too much friction as well, because everyone is at least seeming to be on the up and up, because they also know that other people know they might be the baddie, which means they can't it can't be totally underhanded. You can't have that really awful kind of backstabby moment where you never saw it coming at all, which is friendships are ruined like that. So
I think it's helpful if they do have like a group goal still too.
Yes, exactly. So you've got the overall thing, and then you've got these bits. Yeah.
That's a fabulous. I feel like there are games that have that as their whole mechanic.
I think so. Doesn't is it called Cold Hot War or something?
Yeah.
I think so.
It's a very good power of the medium sort of technique and tool. Yeah. Fabulous. Let's go to companion adventures. Okay, it's companion adventures. This is one of those rare ones where we have like a million things.
Yay!
So let's start with films. I've got 2 films. Looks like you have one. What's your film?
My film is The Reckoning from 2003.
Side note: there are 900 movies called The Reckoning.
Yes, exactly. So watch out. This is the one with this is the one with Paul Bettany as a runaway priest who'd done a murder. That's not a spoiler. It happens in the first few minutes. And Vincent Cassel, weirdly, as a Norman noble. It's a medieval murder mystery. So the main characters are travelling theatre players, and they rock up at this village, and there's been a murder, and the wrong person is in jail for it. And so very Drinshire-esque. And I'm going to say it's not the greatest film ever. There's some sketchy accents in it for a start. But it's one of those sort of better than you would expect numbers. So worth a look.
To give you a sense of how overused The Reckoning is as a title, when I saw you put this in the notes, I discovered that there was a 2021 movie on Shudder, of course, called The Reckoning about witch hunters. And so I thought your pick was, I thought that this was a remake of your pick because it was about witch hunters, but it's not. So anyway, I have 2 film choices. Speaking of Shudder, one is a documentary they released this year called Woodlands Dark and Days Bewitched. I wish I had this for our last episode, actually, but it's fabulous. It's a documentary about folk horror, in particularly a cinema context, but other contexts as well. They talk quite a lot about medieval witch hunter type things, and so I thought that was appropriate here. It's just a good movie too. And then another film is the 1968 Witchfinder General, starring Vincent Price. I actually learned about this from that documentary, and so then I watched it. It is an okay movie. I wouldn't say I loved it, but it is a really, really interesting story about Inquisition and witch hunting. and has some pretty gruesome scenes. It's overall maybe not my favorite movie, but it does have a few really standout grotesque scenes, which are pretty great. We both have some game selections here. My game selections, I'll start. I have Witch, The Road to Lindisfarne from 2012, a fantastic story game where you play a group of people and the witch taking a witch to the holy island of Lindisfarne in order to burn her. The story is really about the witch, these people escorting the witch and their hypocrisies and things like that you have to work through and play. And also the really fun thing is at the end, you all have to decide as players whether you think the witch is actually a witch or not. So that's a fun little thing that the game does. I also have 44, a game of automatic fear from 2010, a game I've played quite a lot. It is a 1950s alien invasion game, but it does some really, really cool things with the idea of paranoia in the setting and how to get that mechanically to happen. So it's super cool.
Nice. I've got Night's Black Agents, the gumshoe game of Jason Bourne versus vampires. It's a paranoid thriller. It has a bunch of different game modes, and one of them is called Mirrors, I think that's what it's called, which is about this idea of people not being what they seem, and it has lots of, mechanical things, which are maybe less useful if you're not running the game, but also actual constructing situations and pyramids of enemies in a way where they will turn your friends into enemies, and sometimes vice versa, which is very useful. And similarly to Behind Closed Doors, it's not really about setting up scenes that are going to happen, but rather about creating a conspiracy structure that you're exploring. And as you interact with that, that's how things improvise out of it. Also got Witch Burner from 2019 by Luca Reyes, a scenario about witch hunting. Just go look it up. It's good. You can find it. I think it's from Hydra Cooperative, I think. And finally, I just want to mention Castle Drakenfelds for Warhammer. You want to talk about a castle with a literal heart that is evil. A bit hard to find, though. I think it's quite out of print. Maybe slightly too much evil furniture that attacks you, but there are some really grisly bits when you do get into the literal heart of the castle and confront the evil sorcerer that is gradually coming back to life within. So if you can find a copy somehow, worth a look for some more of those Castle Ascania kind of vibes.
Castle Ravenloft has a heart as well. Big giant heart in it.
That is true. That's true. I think Drakenfelds came after and tried to one-up it by also having lungs and stuff. So
yeah, good. Indeed, another module we're doing for a future episode, I believe, also has a big heart in the center of it. So yeah, this is a thing that happens in games. Yeah. I just noticed you have a TV option. What's your TV choice?
Oh yeah, so this is another recommendation for something that we don't particularly recommend. There are
I love those.
Yeah, they're great. So Netflix did a deal with the American author Harlan Coben to adapt a whole bunch of his novels into miniseries, and I think I've ended up watching 2 or 3 of them sort of by accident. There's one called Safe, which is about a gated community where stuff starts to happen, one called The Stranger, and these, I will say, they basically have zero nuance. There's a lot of I'm saying my feelings acting, but in the same way that bad books tend to make good films, structurally, I would say this not very good TV show would make a good RPG because it has the way that existing characters reveal hidden agendas on a sort of several times per episode basis, but without straining your credulity too much, is pretty good and very stealable. So I recommend it for that reason. They are that sort of TV show where you sort of think, I'm not enjoying this that much, but I do need to find out what was up with that thing last episode, so I am going to keep watching.
It's like reading Agatha Christie.
Exactly. So it's sort of that level of thing.
I love it.
And you've got are you recommending yourself on YouTube again, Jason?
I am, indeed I am. Yeah, no, I do have a YouTube recommendation. So sometimes showing is better than telling, and I think that my actual play of... Well, so my play of Behind Closed Doors is not online, but my playthrough of the scenario I mentioned earlier, the Croatoa, is. And I got very high marks from my players for how, in the first session especially, I was able to create a sense of paranoia in that whole series, but especially in the first session. That particular session was created whole cloth from this scenario book, Trophy Loom. And so it wasn't just in how we RP'd it, but also in how I wrote and structured the scenario. And so I think if you just want a good reference for the things we were talking about in the Expert Delve, you should go watch that. I think it's a good one. And finally, music. We have some music choices. Yes. My music option is Avalanche by Leonard Cohen from the 1971 album Songs of Love and Hate, which is a very good album, by the way.
It is, yeah.
I was trying to think of sad scary beast people music. And Avalanche felt like a good choice because it's about this twisted person in a gold mine and how they're abandoned by society. And behind closed doors, the beast people, they've been kind of abandoned to the forest upon birth. So I thought it was a good thematic fit.
Nice one. My music recommendation is the Swiss folk metal band Eluveiti, Eluveitie. All of their music is recorded in Gaulish and using traditional Celtic instruments. But I think the one I recommend as a maybe soundtrack to Behind Closed Doors is Evocation 2 Pantheon from 2017, because it's more folk and not too metally. So it's all this menacing atmospheric drones and drums and so forth. So give that a go.
Fantastic. Listeners, that is our show. Fear of a Black Dragon is a production of The Gauntlet. You can find The Gauntlet on Twitter at GauntletRPG. We have a website. It is gauntlet-rpg.com. If you'd like to support the show on Patreon, financially that is, patreon.com/gauntlet is how you can do that. Tom, thank you so much.
Jason, thank you. And thanks to our inquisitive editor, Rich Rogers. Thanks for listening. Goodbye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.